Marcus Rivera had been looking forward to this Saturday morning for weeks. The sound of gentle water lapping against the edges of his brand-new pool mixed with the distant hum of suburban weekend life, creating the perfect soundtrack for his first real day of relaxation in months. He adjusted his position on the floating lounge chair, cold beer in hand, and closed his eyes against the warm June sun. After 18 years of putting out fires, literally and figuratively, as the city's fire marshal, he finally built his dream backyard oasis. The installation had taken 3 months, countless permit applications, and more inspections than he cared to count. But every hoop he jumped through was worth it for moments like this. The crystal-clear water reflected the cloudless sky, and the new pool deck gleamed under the morning light. His wife Sophia had already claimed the shallow end with her book, their teenage daughter Emma was texting friends about coming over later, and even their old golden retriever Max seemed to approve, having found the perfect shady spot beside the new poolside furniture. "This is what contentment feels like," Marcus murmured to himself, taking another sip of his beer and letting his shoulders finally relax for the first time in months. That contentment lasted exactly 12 more minutes. "Excuse me, excuse me." The shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning like a fire alarm in the dead of night. Marcus opened his eyes to see a woman in her 50s marching across his backyard, her face flushed red with indignation, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. "Karen Pemberton, you should have known." Marcus had moved to Maple Street 8 months ago, specifically choosing this quiet cul-de-sac for its family-friendly atmosphere and well-maintained properties. Most of his neighbors had been welcoming, bringing casseroles and offering to help with the move. Karen, however, had introduced herself by complaining about his moving truck blocking her view of the street for the 3 hours it took to unload his furniture. "Ma'am, you're on my property," Marcus said calmly, not bothering to get off his float. His years of municipal work had taught him that the best way to handle difficult people was to remain composed while they revealed their true nature. "Don't you ma'am me," Karen snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at the pool. "Do you have any idea how loud this thing is? The pump has been running since 6 a.m. Some of us are trying to enjoy our weekends in peace." Marcus glanced at his watch. It was 10:47 a.m. He looked over at Sophia, who had lowered her book and was watching the interaction with raised eyebrows. Even she could see the absurdity. The pool pump was barely audible from their own patio, let alone from Karen's house, which sat a full lot and a half away. "The pump runs on a timer," Marcus explained patiently. "It's set to operate during daylight hours for optimal energy efficiency and water quality. The noise level is well within residential guidelines." "Guidelines?" Karen's voice pitched higher. "Who are you to talk about guidelines? I've been living in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I know what belongs here. And THIS, she gestured wildly at the pool, doesn't belong in a residential area." Marcus finally paddled to the pool's edge and climbed out, water dripping from his swim trunks. At 6'2", with the kind of steady presence that came from years of handling emergencies, his mere standing seemed to give Karen pause, but only for a moment. "Furthermore," she continued, her confidence returning, "I've been researching, and I don't think you have the proper permits for this installation. The setbacks are all wrong, the safety barriers are inadequate, and don't even get me started on the electrical work. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Now Marcus was genuinely curious. "Have you been measuring my property lines, Karen?" "I have every right to protect my property values," she shot back. "And I'm telling you right now, either you fix these violations or I'm calling the authorities, the police, code enforcement, whoever it takes." Sophia stood up from her chair, her protective instincts kicking in. "Karen, you need to leave our property. Now, don't think you can intimidate me." Karen's face had progressed from red to purple. "I know people in this city, important people, and when they hear about this disaster you've created, there will be consequences." Marcus reached for his towel with deliberate calm. In his line of work, he'd learned that people like Karen fed off emotional reactions. The angrier she got while he remained composed, the more she revealed about her true motivations. "Karen," he said quietly, "I followed every permit requirement, building code, and safety regulation to the letter. Everything was inspected and approved by the appropriate departments. If you have specific concerns about code violations, you're welcome to file a formal complaint through the proper channels." "Oh, I will," she snarled. "Don't you worry about that. By Monday morning, this whole neighborhood will know what kind of people you really are." She spun on her heel and stomped back toward her house, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear about new people with no respect, and someone needs to teach them how things work around here. Marcus watched her go, then looked at Sophia and Emma, who had emerged from the house to witness the spectacle. Emma shook her head in teenage disgust. "What is wrong with that lady?" "Some people," Marcus said thoughtfully, wrapping the towel around his shoulders, "think that being loud and aggressive will get them what they want. They're usually wrong." He had no idea how spectacularly wrong Karen was about to be proven. As the Rivera family tried to salvage their peaceful Saturday, none of them noticed Karen in her front window. Cell phone pressed to her ear, speaking in urgent, animated tones to whoever had answered her call. The game was just beginning. By Monday morning, Karen Pemberton had transformed from an irritated neighbor into a woman possessed. She sat at her kitchen table surrounded by printed copies of city ordinances, HOA bylaws, and a legal pad filled with her cramped handwriting. Her first call to the police on Saturday had been just the opening salvo. Now she was preparing for total war. The responding officer that weekend had been polite but unimpressed. After a brief inspection of Marcus' pool area, Officer Johnson had explained that noise ordinances didn't apply to standard pool equipment operating during daytime hours, and that property line disputes required surveyor documentation, not eyeball estimates. Karen had watched from her window as he shook hands with Marcus and actually complimented the pool installation before leaving. That rejection had only fueled her determination. "Hello, guess I need to speak to someone about code enforcement," Karen said into her phone, her voice taking on the tone she reserved for official complaints. "I have a serious violation in my neighborhood that needs immediate attention." The woman on the other end of the line sounded tired before the conversation even began. "What type of violation are you reporting, ma'am?" "Multiple violations," Karen said, consulting her notes. "Improper setbacks from property lines, inadequate safety barriers around a swimming pool, potential electrical hazards, and construction without proper permits. The homeowner is creating a dangerous situation that threatens the entire neighborhood." "I see. And you've attempted to resolve this directly with the homeowner?" Karen's grip tightened on the phone. "The homeowner is completely uncooperative. He claims everything is legal, but I know better. I've lived in this community for 15 years and I know what's allowed. We'll add this to our inspection queue. Someone will be out within the next 2 weeks, though." 2 weeks? Karen's voice rose sharply. "This is a safety issue. There are children in this neighborhood. What if someone gets hurt while you're taking your time?" The code enforcement officer sighed audibly. "Ma'am, unless there's an immediate threat to life or property, routine inspections are scheduled in order of receipt. If you believe there's an emergency situation, you should contact 911. After hanging up, Karen immediately dialed the homeowners association. Surely they would take her concerns seriously. The HOA president, Mrs. Chen, had always been reasonable about maintaining neighborhood standards. "Margaret, it's Karen Pemberton on Maple Street," she began, her tone shifting to friendly concern. "I'm calling about a serious situation that's developed with one of our newer residents." "Oh, the Riveras." Margaret Chen's voice warmed. "Lovely family. Marcus helped my husband with some questions about our outdoor fire pit safety just last month. Very knowledgeable about building codes." Karen felt her stomach drop. "Well, yes, but is this about their beautiful new pool? I drove by yesterday and it looks absolutely professional. Sophia mentioned they went through months of permits and inspections. I'm so glad they chose our neighborhood." "Margaret, you don't understand." Karen pressed on desperately. "The installation violates multiple HOA guidelines. The size restrictions, the aesthetic requirements, the noise considerations." Margaret's tone grew cooler. "Have you actually reviewed our HOA covenants recently? Pool installations are specifically addressed in Section 12. As long as they meet city codes and don't exceed lot coverage percentages, they're perfectly acceptable. And frankly, their landscaping around the pool area is some of the best I've seen." After Margaret politely but firmly ended the call, Karen sat staring at her legal pad, her neat list of violations suddenly seeming less authoritative. But she wasn't defeated. If the local authorities wouldn't listen, she'd go higher. Her next call was to the city council member for their district. Councilman Bradley had always been responsive to her concerns about neighborhood issues. Surely he would understand the gravity of the situation. "Councilman Bradley's office, this is Janet." "Janet, this is Karen Pemberton. I need to speak with the councilman about an urgent code violation in my neighborhood that the appropriate departments are ignoring." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pemberton, but the councilman can't intervene in ongoing code enforcement matters. If you file the complaint, you'll need to let the process." "The process isn't working," Karen snapped. "I'm a taxpayer and a voter, and I deserve to have my concerns taken seriously." "Ma'am, if you'd like to submit your concerns in writing, the councilman reviews all constituent correspondence, but he cannot override departmental procedures." Karen hung up without saying goodbye. By Tuesday afternoon, her campaign had expanded to include calls to the water department. Improper pool drainage could affect the municipal system, the environmental health department, chlorine runoff threatens local groundwater, even the county assessor, unpermitted improvements affecting property valuations. Each call followed the same pattern: initial concern from the recipient, followed by questions Karen couldn't adequately answer, followed by promises to look into it that she knew meant absolutely nothing. It was during her call to the fire department that her frustration reached its peak. Fire Prevention Bureau, this is Sandy. I need to report a potential fire hazard, Karen said, having decided that framing everything as an emergency might get faster results. There's a residential pool installation with what appears to be improper electrical work. Given the combination of water and electricity, this could be extremely dangerous. I see. Can you describe the specific electrical hazard you've observed? Karen hesitated. She hadn't actually seen any electrical work, just assumed there must be problems. Well, there are pumps and lighting systems, and I don't believe they were installed by licensed electricians. Ma'am, all electrical work for pool installations requires city permits and licensed contractor certification. Has the homeowner shown you documentation that suggests otherwise? The homeowner refuses to cooperate with reasonable neighbor concerns. I understand your worry, but without specific evidence of code violations, we can't initiate an investigation based on assumptions. However, if you'd like to file a formal complaint, our fire marshal can add it to his inspection schedule. Karen's pen had been scribbling notes throughout the call, but she stopped at those words. Fire marshal. Now that sounded official. That sounded like someone with real authority who wouldn't brush off her legitimate concerns. Yes, she said firmly. I want to file a formal complaint for the fire marshal. This is exactly the kind of situation that requires expert evaluation. I'll transfer you to Fire Marshal Rivera's office. Please hold. Karen smiled for the first time in days as she waited for the transfer. Finally, someone with the authority and expertise to shut down Marcus's pool operation once and for all. She had no way of knowing that the universe was about to deliver the most exquisite irony of her entire complaint-filled life. The phone clicked as the transfer went through. Fire Marshal's office, Mrs. Carmen. How can I help you? Karen launched into her most detailed and passionate complaint yet, describing safety violations, uncooperative neighbors, and the urgent need for official intervention. Carmen listened patiently, asking for the address and taking detailed notes. I'll make sure Fire Marshal Rivera gets this information, Carmen said professionally. He takes residential safety very seriously, especially pool-related concerns. I'll have him add this to his inspection schedule. When might he be able to come out? Karen asked eagerly. He's been quite busy lately, but given the nature of your concerns, I'd expect him to prioritize this, probably within the next few days. Karen hung up feeling triumphant for the first time since Saturday. The fire marshal would see what all these other bureaucrats had missed. He would vindicate her concerns and force Marcus to face the consequences of his arrogance. She had no idea that Fire Marshal Rivera was, at that very moment, floating peacefully in his perfectly legal, thoroughly inspected, completely up-to-code swimming pool, wondering who had filed a complaint about residential pool safety on Maple Street. The irony was about to reach nuclear levels. Thursday morning arrived with the precision of a military operation. Marcus was enjoying his coffee on the pool deck when the first official vehicle pulled into his driveway at exactly 8:30 a.m. He recognized the white truck immediately, city code enforcement, right on schedule. Here we go, he murmured to Sophia, who was getting ready for work. She paused at the sliding door, her expression mixing amusement with concern. Are you sure you want to handle this the way we discussed? She asked. You could just tell them who you are and end this whole thing right now. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that came from 20 years of dealing with people who thought they knew better than trained professionals. Where's the educational value in that? Besides, I'm genuinely curious to see how thorough these inspections will be. The code enforcement officer was a young man named David Chen, no relation to the HOA president, who approached with the slightly weary expression of someone who'd handled his share of neighbor disputes. He carried a tablet, measuring tape, and the kind of clipboard that meant serious business. Mr. Rivera, I'm Officer Chen with Code Enforcement. We received a complaint about possible violations related to your pool installation. Do you have a few minutes to walk through the property? Absolutely, Marcus said, extending his hand. I've been expecting this call. Can I ask what specific violations were reported? David consulted his tablet. Let's see, improper setbacks from property lines, inadequate safety barriers, possible unpermitted construction, and he scrolled down. Concerns about electrical and plumbing work not meeting code standards. From her front window, Karen watched the proceedings with barely contained excitement. She positioned herself at the perfect angle to observe the entire inspection, a notebook ready to document every violation the officer discovered. This was it, vindication at last. Well, let's start with the permits, Marcus said casually. I have all the documentation inside if you'd like to review it. He returned with a folder thick enough to impress any bureaucrat. David's eyebrows rose as Marcus spread out permit applications, approval letters, inspection certificates, and contractor licenses across the patio table. This is very thorough, David admitted, photographing each document with his tablet. Most homeowners don't keep such detailed records. I believe in following proper procedures, Marcus replied with perfect sincerity. They moved on to the physical inspection. David methodically measured setbacks from the property lines, finding them not only compliant but actually more generous than required. The safety barriers exceeded minimum height requirements. The pool equipment was properly screened and positioned according to noise ordinances. "Can I see your electrical panel?" Dave asked, clearly going through his checklist despite finding nothing wrong so far. Marcus led him to the main electrical panel, where neat professional labeling indicated every circuit. The pool equipment had its own dedicated breaker, properly sized and protected with DSI outlets as required by current electrical codes. "Your electrician did excellent work," David noted, taking photos. "Everything's labeled, properly grounded, and up to current standards." Karen, watching from her window, felt her confidence wavering as the inspection continued without any dramatic confrontations or citation writing. The officer seemed almost impressed. At 9:45 a.m., a second vehicle arrived. This time, it was the water department responding to Karen's complaint about potential drainage issues. The inspector, Maria Santos, went through an equally thorough process examining the pool's drainage system, backwash procedures, and chemical storage. "Your contractor really knew what they were doing," Maria told Marcus as she completed her inspection. "The drainage ties into the storm system exactly as it should, and your chemical storage exceeds safety requirements." By 10:30 a.m., Karen was pacing in her living room. 2 inspections, 0 violations. But she still had hope the fire marshal hadn't arrived yet, and surely he would be more thorough than these local inspectors. The third vehicle to arrive was from the Environmental Health Department, a response to Karen's concerns about chemical runoff. This inspector, James Park, actually spent time testing water samples and examining the pool's filtration system. "Mrs. Pemberton called this in as a potential groundwater contamination issue," James explained to Marcus. "But honestly, looking at your setup, I'm not sure what she was worried about. Your chemical levels are perfect and the containment systems are textbook." "Mrs. Pemberton seems very concerned about neighborhood safety," Marcus replied diplomatically. "I appreciate everyone taking the time to ensure everything meets standards." James glanced toward Karen's house, where the curtains had been twitching all morning. "We get a lot of calls from that address," he said quietly, "usually about issues that turn out to be less serious than reported." The morning continued with visits from a building inspector responding to concerns about structural integrity, an electrical inspector following up on the fire safety complaint, and even a representative from the HOA who came by to document that everything was indeed perfectly compliant with neighborhood covenants. Each inspection followed the same pattern: initial skepticism, growing appreciation for the quality of the insulation, and ultimately complete approval. Marcus provided documentation, answered questions, and remained the picture of cooperative professionalism. By noon, Karen had watched 6 different officials examine Marcus's pool from every conceivable angle. 6 inspections, 0 violations, 0 citations, 0 vindication for her complaints. But she still had one card left to play. At 12:30 p.m., just as the last inspector was leaving, a red SUV with official city markings pulled into the driveway. Karen's heart leaped as she saw the door logo. Fire Marshal. This was it. The Fire Marshal would surely find what all these other inspectors had missed. Fire safety was serious business. There had to be violations related to electrical hazards, emergency access, or chemical storage. Someone with real expertise would finally see through Marcus's facade of compliance. She watched as a tall, professional-looking man in a crisp uniform stepped out of the vehicle. Even from her window, she could see the authority in his bearing, the kind of presence that came from years of dealing with life-and-death situations. Fire Marshal Rivera surveyed the property with a practiced eye of someone who'd seen every possible safety violation. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew codes and regulations better than most people knew their own names. Karen grabbed her binoculars for a better view. This was going to be good. The fire marshal approached the front door and rang the bell. Karen held her breath, waiting for the confrontation she'd been anticipating all week. Finally, Marcus would have to face someone who couldn't be charmed or fooled by neat paperwork and friendly cooperation. The door opened and Karen leaned forward, focusing her binoculars on the scene. The fire marshal stood face to face with Marcus Rivera. Both men were perfectly still for a moment. Then, to Karen's complete bewilderment, the fire marshal started laughing. Not just chuckling. Full, deep, appreciative laughter that carried across the quiet neighborhood like thunder before a storm. Marcus joined in, and the 2 men shook hands like old friends meeting for lunch. Karen lowered her binoculars slowly, a cold dread beginning to creep up her spine. Something was very, very wrong with this picture. Or, from Marcus's perspective, something was about to go very, very right. The laughter echoing across Maple Street had an almost musical quality to it, the kind of genuine amusement that comes from discovering life's most perfectly orchestrated ironies. Karen pressed her face against her window, binoculars trembling in her hands as she watched the fire marshal and Marcus Rivera continue their animated conversation on the front porch. "I cannot believe Fire Marshal Rivera said, wiping tears from his eyes, that someone filed a complaint about my own pool." Marcus Rivera, the same Marcus Rivera, grinned and shook his head. "When Carmen told me we had a residential pool safety complaint on Maple Street, I figured it had to be Karen. But I never imagined the poetic justice would be quite this perfect." The two men weren't old friends meeting for lunch. They were the same person. Marcus Rivera, mild-mannered neighbor and pool owner, was also Fire Marshal Rivera, the city official responsible for investigating fire safety complaints. The man Karen had been demanding come inspect Marcus's dangerous pool installation was Marcus himself. "So walk me through your week," Marcus said to himself with mock seriousness, pulling out his official inspection tablet. "I understand there have been multiple complaints filed by one very persistent neighbor." From her window, Karen watched in growing horror as the fire marshal, her last hope for vindication, began conducting what appeared to be the most casual inspection in municipal history. Instead of the thorough violation-finding investigation she'd been counting on, she saw Marcus examining his own pool with the kind of professional competence that comes from 18 years of fire safety expertise. "Let's see," Marcus muttered, making notes on his tablet. "Electrical systems." He examined the pool equipment. He'd personally overseen the installation of equipment that had been inspected and approved by his own department months earlier. All circuits properly protected, GFCI outlets installed per code, no extension cord usage. Check. He moved to the chemical storage area. Pool chemicals stored in original containers, proper ventilation, no incompatible materials stored together, adequate separation from ignition sources. Check. The pool barriers came next. Height exceeds minimum requirements, self-closing and self-latching gates, no climbing hazards within the restricted zone. Check. Emergency access received the same treatment. Clear pathways for emergency responders, adequate lighting, no obstructions to equipment access. Check. Karen's legs gave out and she sank into the chair beside her window. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent an entire week harassing city officials, filing complaints, and demanding investigations of a man who was himself one of the highest-ranking safety officials in the municipality. But the revelation got worse. As Marcus continued his inspection, he began speaking loud enough for his voice to carry across the quiet neighborhood, loud enough for Karen to hear every word through her open window. "You know what's interesting about this complaint?" Marcus said conversationally, as if addressing someone else but clearly projecting his voice. The complainant claimed there were multiple safety violations, but she never actually identified any specific hazards, just vague concerns about improper this and inadequate that. He walked over to the property line Karen had claimed was violated. Using his official measuring tape, he verified what every other inspector had already confirmed. The setbacks exceeded requirements by nearly 3 feet. Complainant also suggested the electrical work wasn't done by licensed professionals, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone documenting findings for an official report. But the permits clearly show all work was performed by Morrison Electric, a contractor I've personally worked with on dozens of commercial projects. Impeccable safety record. Karen felt her face burning with shame and rage. Every complaint she filed, every concern she'd raised was being systematically demolished by the one person she thought would vindicate her. But Marcus wasn't finished. "The most interesting aspect of this case," he said, now clearly addressing his comments toward Karen's house, "is that the complainant appears to have filed multiple reports with different departments, each claiming urgent safety concerns without ever actually observing any safety violations or attempting good faith communication with the property owner." He made a note on his tablet with deliberate flourish. "In my professional experience, this pattern suggests the complaints may have been motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate safety concerns. This type of misuse of municipal resources is something we take quite seriously." Karen's notebook fell from her lap as she realized the implications. She hadn't just been wrong about the violations. She'd been filing false reports with city departments. And now the person responsible for investigating those reports knew exactly who had filed them and why. Marcus completed his inspection with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared about safety compliance, but also with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Every system, every installation, every safety measure met or exceeded current codes because Marcus had personally ensured they would during the planning and installation process. "Final determination," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the neighborhood with official authority, "is that this residential pool installation meets or exceeds all applicable safety codes and presents no fire hazards or safety concerns. The complaints filed regarding this property appear to be without merit." He closed his tablet and looked directly at Karen's house for the first time. "However," he continued, his tone shifting to something more serious, The pattern of complaints suggests a possible misuse of emergency services and municipal resources. I'll be recommending that all departments involved document these findings and consider appropriate follow-up action regarding frivolous complaints. Karen ducked below her windowsill, as if that could somehow hide her from the consequences of her week-long campaign. Her hands shook as the full weight of her situation became clear. She hadn't just been wrong. She'd been spectacularly, humiliatingly, potentially legally wrong. Marcus gathered his inspection materials and headed back toward his official vehicle, but paused at the end of his driveway. In a voice that carried just far enough, he called out what sounded like a casual comment to no one in particular. You know, it's amazing how quickly neighborhood disputes can escalate when people make assumptions instead of asking questions. Good thing we have proper procedures in place to separate legitimate safety concerns from personal grievances. As the fire marshal's vehicle pulled away from Maple Street, Karen remained crouched below her window. Her week of righteous indignation transformed into a crushing realization of how thoroughly she had misjudged the situation. The fire marshal hadn't just inspected Marcus's pool and found it compliant. The fire marshal had revealed himself to be Marcus, and in doing so had turned Karen from a concerned neighbor into a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions, harassment, and the spectacular backfire that awaits those who refuse to mind their own business. The game wasn't just over. Karen had been playing against the house the entire time, and the house always wins. The weekend following Marcus's official inspection brought an unusual quiet to Maple Street. Karen hadn't been seen outside her house since Thursday afternoon, and the neighborhood seemed to collectively exhale in relief. But Marcus Rivera, both the neighbor and the fire marshal, wasn't quite finished with his educational demonstration. Saturday morning found him once again floating peacefully in his pool, but this time he wasn't alone. Word had somehow spread through the neighborhood about the week's events, and the Riveras were hosting what had spontaneously become a pool safety and code compliance celebration. I still can't believe she called 6 different departments, laughed Margaret Chen, the HOA president, as she watched her grandchildren splash in the shallow end. And none of them found a single violation. 7 departments, Marcus corrected with a grin, flipping burgers on his new poolside grill. She also called the county assessor about unpermitted improvements affecting property values. David Chen, the young code enforcement officer, looked up from his lawn chair. We actually get calls from that address about once a month, usually about someone's grass being too long or holiday decorations staying up too late. This was definitely her most ambitious complaint. The gathering had started as a simple neighborhood barbecue, but it had evolved into something more meaningful. For the first time in months, Maple Street residents were actually talking to each other about community issues instead of hiding from one potentially problematic neighbor. Marcus, said Tom Bradley from 2 houses down, I've been meaning to ask when I install my deck next spring. Would you mind taking a look at my plans? I'd want to make sure everything's up to code before I submit for permits. Absolutely, Marcus replied. That's exactly how these things should work. Communication first, conflicts never. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Karen's front door opened for the first time since Thursday. She emerged cautiously, clearly intending to collect her mail quickly and retreat back inside. But the sight of the neighborhood gathering around Marcus's pool stopped her cold. The conversation gradually died as residents noticed her presence. Karen stood frozen on her front steps, still in her bathrobe at noon on Saturday, looking like someone who hadn't slept in days. Marcus set down his spatula and walked to the fence that separated his backyard from the street. When he spoke, his voice carried the same professional tone he used during his inspection, but without any malice. Karen, he called out, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. Would you like to join us? I think there are some things we should discuss as neighbors. Karen's face cycled through several emotions: embarrassment, defiance, fear, and finally something that might have been resignation. She walked slowly toward the fence, her posture suggesting someone approaching their own execution. I suppose, she said quietly, you're all here to celebrate my humiliation. Actually, Marcus replied, his tone remaining steady, we're here to celebrate good neighbors looking out for each other, which is what I thought you were trying to do, even if your methods were unconventional. The unexpected kindness seemed to deflate Karen's remaining defenses. Her shoulders sagged as she looked around at the faces of neighbors she spent years alienating with complaints and confrontations. I know what you all think of me, she said, her voice barely audible. The crazy lady who calls about everything. But I've lived here for 15 years and I've watched this neighborhood change, and I wanted things to stay the way they were. Margaret Chen, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. Karen, we understand that change can be difficult. But Marcus's pool doesn't change the character of our neighborhood. It enhances it. Look around. When's the last time you saw this many neighbors actually talking to each other? Marcus leaned against the fence, his expression thoughtful. Karen, can I ask you something? In all the time you spent researching violations and filing complaints, did you ever actually come over and ask to see the permits? Or talk to me about your concerns directly. Karen's silence was answer enough. Because if you had, Marcus continued, I would have been happy to show you everything. The engineering reports, the safety certifications, the inspection records. I would have explained why we chose each safety feature and how everything was designed to exceed minimum requirements. I thought you were just another new resident who didn't care about neighborhood standards, Karen admitted. I didn't know you were. A fire marshal, Marcus smiled. Karen, even if I were just a regular homeowner, every single safety measure we installed would still be exactly the same. My job did make my pools safer. Following proper procedures and working with licensed professionals did that. Officer David Chen stood up from his chair. Mrs. Pemberton, I want you to know that we're not planning any action regarding the complaints you filed. Everyone understands that you genuinely believe there were safety issues. But in the future, we'd appreciate it if you could try direct communication before involving city departments. Karen nodded miserably. I know I'm in a fool of myself. The whole neighborhood probably thinks I'm ridiculous. Actually, said Tom Bradley, surprising everyone, I think you're exactly the kind of neighbor we need. Someone who pays attention and cares about safety. You just need to channel that energy more effectively. Marcus nodded in agreement. Karen, would you be interested in joining our Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Committee? We could use someone with your attention to detail to help ensure everyone's properties meet safety standards. The offer clearly stunned Karen. After a week of humiliation and the prospect of becoming a neighborhood pariah, she was being invited to contribute rather than condemned. You want me to help with safety inspections? After everything I did? Especially after everything you did, Marcus replied. You've proven you'll go to extraordinary lengths when you believe there's a safety issue. That's exactly the kind of commitment we need, just pointed in the right direction. For the first time in days, Karen's posture straightened slightly. I would like that. I really would. Great, Marcus said, extending his hand over the fence. Partners in neighborhood safety? Karen shook his hand, and for the first time since anyone could remember, she smiled genuinely. As the afternoon continued, something remarkable happened. Karen didn't join the pool party. That would have been too much too fast. But she didn't retreat to her house either. She stayed by the fence, gradually joining conversations about property maintenance, safety improvements, and community standards. By evening, as neighbors began heading home, Karen approached Marcus one final time. I owe you an apology, she said quietly, not just for the complaints, but for assuming the worst about you without giving you a chance to prove otherwise. Apology accepted, Marcus replied. But I owe you one too. I could have ended this whole thing on day one by just telling you who I was. I let my ego enjoy the situation a little too much. Karen actually laughed, a sound so rare that several departing neighbors turned to look. Well, I can't say I didn't deserve it. And I definitely learned my lesson about making assumptions. As the sun set over Maple Street, Marcus floated once more in his perfectly legal, thoroughly inspected, completely code-compliant pool. But this time, instead of being interrupted by angry confrontations, he was planning neighborhood safety workshops with his former nemesis. Sometimes the best justice isn't revenge. It's the satisfaction of turning an enemy into an ally and proving that most conflicts can be resolved with a little patience, a lot of professionalism, and the occasional perfectly timed revelation.